A Tale of Good Luck and Mrs. Featherfuss. Have you ever heard someone say, "I met with good luck today"? It all sounds as if good luck were a kind of person. And something like that is what people used to believe, as this story tells. Once upon a time, many years ago, old Mrs. Featherfuss was standing at her garden gate. She was a large, stout person with white hair and a very clean white apron. The house was very clean and white too. The stones of her garden path were as white as stones could possibly be, and so were the palings of her garden. It was a very tidy garden. There were no flowers in it, but there was a row of parsley down each side of the path, and there were neat rows of vegetables, carrots with feathery tops turning red and golden yellow, dark crimson beetroot, stout green cabbages, and a shining celery. Old Mrs. Featherfuss looked as if she liked good things to eat, and so she did. As she stood there, she was thinking of the little black pig in the sty at the back of her house, and how fat he was growing, and how good he would taste with sage and onions and apple sauce. "Oh, but I must not stand here wasting time," she said to herself. "I must go and make up the fire and see about my tea." Just as she was turning from the gate, an old beggar man came hobbling down the road. He seemed very lame and very tired. Old Mrs. Featherfuss hurried up the path for fear he should ask for something. "I've got enough to do to look after myself," said she. The beggar stopped a moment and leaned against the palings as if he would like a rest. But Mrs. Featherfuss bustled round the corner of her house and into her kitchen by the back door. She shut the door with a very loud slam and began to poke up her fire to boil the kettle to make a cup of tea. The beggar man shook his head and sighed and went on down the road. There was another house a little farther on, a very tiny one. It had a thatched roof that came low down, just like a comfortable old hat pulled over somebody's head. A rose bush grew on one side of the door and a red fuchsia on the other. They almost hid the front of the tiny house, and its little windows peeped out like two bright eyes. There was a cabbage patch on one side of the garden path, and on the other side there were flowers. Michaelmas daisies, buttony brown chrysanthemums, and pink and blue asters. As the beggar came down the road, an old woman in a blue checked apron came out of the little house. Her name was Betsy Pinkpottle, and she lived there all alone with her big tabby cat for company. Her face was all brown and rosy and wrinkled like a little old apple, and her brown eyes twinkled very kindly. The beggar man looked at her and nodded his head as if he saw something pleasant. "Good evening, missus," he said. "Could you spare a poor old man a bit of bread and cheese?" Betsy's eyes twinkled more than ever. "I can give you something better than that," she said. "I have got no cheese, but what would you say to a fine, large, rosy apple? I had 3 beautiful ones given to me today. I was just going to have one for my tea, and you're welcome to one too. Indeed you are." She trotted into the kitchen and came out again with a large red apple and a big slice of bread on a blue and white plate. The beggar man thanked her and settled down on an old tree trunk by the side of the road to eat. Presently he came to the door. It was standing wide open, and Betsy was sitting at the table finishing her tea. "Here is the plate, missus," said he. "My thanks to you, and may what you begin at sunset go on till moontime without stop or stay." And then he went hobbling down the road. Betsy came to the door and stood watching him and wondering what he meant. "Well, the sun is setting sure enough," she said to herself. "But there's naught to be done but tidy the kitchen. What should I be doing till moontime?" She stepped back into the house and picked up the apple that was left and put it on the shelf. Then she turned again to clear away the tea things. But there was still an apple on the table. "Oh, bless me," said Betsy. "Where did that come from?" It was large and round and red and shining. Betsy touched it. It was certainly a real apple, and as it was on her kitchen table, it must certainly belong to her, so she put it on the shelf beside the other. They looked very nice sitting there, and Betsy admired them with her head on one side, and when she turned round, there was another apple on the table, in the very same place, a beautiful, streaky, red and yellow one. "Well, I never did," said Betsy, and she picked it up and put it by the side of the other two. "3 lovely apples," she said, and so there were. When she looked at the table again, there was a 4th, all ready for her, just as round and as rosy as the other 3. After that there was another, and another, and Betsy went on for a whole hour, taking apples off the table and putting them on her kitchen shelves. There were rows and rows of them. Her arm was really beginning to ache when at last she turned round and found no apple on the table. "Well," said Betsy, "that is the last. Where they came from I don't understand, but a beautiful lot of apples they are." And then she thought of the beggarman's saying, "May what you begin at sunset go on till moontime." She opened the door and looked out, and there, low down in the sky, was the tiniest, newest new moon that was ever seen. Betsy dropped 3 curtsies to it as her grandmother had taught her. "From sunset to moontime," she said, "those apples came from the beggar-man. Good luck has surely come my way today." The next morning, Betsy Pinkbottle was busy trotting round to all her neighbours, giving a red apple here and another one there, and telling the tale of the wonderful beggar. Everyone said, "Well, you did have good luck yesterday, I'm sure," and everyone was pleased, except old Mrs. Featherfuss. She was very angry. "To think," she said, "that I saw him coming down the road and never asked him in. If he comes this way again, he shall come to me, and I shall get something better than a lot of apples, I'll be bound." So every afternoon she stood at her garden gate with her clean white apron on, waiting for the lame beggar to come down the road. One day, about 2 weeks later, he came. Mrs. Featherfuss bustled out to meet the beggar-man. She invited him to come in and take something to eat. She hurried him up the path and in at the front door. She sat him down in the best armchair in the parlour, and then she gave him plum cake and bread and cheese and bread and butter and bread and jam and a mug of cider to drink. She sat by him and thought what a large meal he was eating, and counted up in her mind all she hoped to get in return. Presently he got up to go. Mrs. Featherfuss showed him politely to the door, and there he said, "Thank you, mistress. Good evening to you, and may what you begin at sunset go on till moontime, with never a stop or stay." And then he hobbled down the path and away. Old Mrs. Featherfuss turned back into the house. It was just sunset. "I must be quick," she said. "There's not much time before moonrise. It's a good thing I put the money ready." And she looked at the fat bag of shillings and sixpences, half-crowns and florins, standing on the table. "All I need to do is just to open it and pour out the silver. It will go on pouring until moonrise, and I shall be a rich woman by that time." It was a beautiful plan, and perhaps it would have succeeded quite well if she had not upset the jug of cider in her hurry to seize the bag. "Oh, dear, dear," said Mrs. Featherfuss. "What a terrible mess." She snatched up the cloth and began to mop up the cider. There seemed to be a great deal of it. "I never thought that jug held so much," she said. She wiped and mopped, and still the cider dripped and poured onto the parlour floor. She ran and fetched another cloth and a pail from the kitchen. The parlour floor seemed to be swimming in cider by the time she got back. The carpet was soaked, and there was a stream running down the passage into the kitchen. "Dear, dear, dear, what a terrible mess," said old Mrs. Featherfuss. She put the pail by the table to catch the cider, and ran back to the kitchen to fetch her long-handled mop. Just as she got there, the cider stopped running, and old Mrs. Featherfuss, with the mop in her hand and a very red face, stood staring through the kitchen window at a large round full moon that was just rising out of a bank of grey mist beyond the fields and hedges. "From sunset to moontime," she said, "and all I've got is a spoilt parlour carpet and a pail full of cider." That was all she ever did get. It took her most of the night to clean up the house, and the parlour carpet was never quite the same again.